Thank you for being here. My name is Elliot Slosser, Elliot Slosar. I'm an attorney at a civil rights law firm in Chicago in Loeby, Loeby. To my right is our client, Patrick Baker, who was recently exonerated by Governor Bevin through a pardon.
And I am Amy Robinson Staples, also an attorney here on behalf of Mr. Baker.
We're here today because Governor Bevin did a courageous act in having people under his command look into the troubling case that led to Patrick's wrongful conviction. And sadly, Patrick is just one of many people who were wrongfully prosecuted by Kentucky State police officers and the Knox County Commonwealth Attorney's Office over the past few years. In this case, like other cases, it is the same police officers involved from the Kentucky State Police. And I know that there's been a lot of innuendo and speculation that has been written in various newspapers and spoken by various politicians in this case. And our hope today is that you all will have the real story, the story that actually discusses the facts of this case. Because from what I have read, nobody has talked about what actually happened in the underlying criminal investigation or the trial. DNA evidence excludes Patrick Baker from killing Donald Mills. There were handcuffs left at the scene of the crime where the Kentucky State Police Laboratory tested those cuffs and they excluded Patrick Baker. Those cuffs were left by the shooter. The second person who was in the house, who's pled guilty and testified against Mr. Baker, Christopher Wagner, he also was excluded from contributing DNA on those handcuffs. The real killer, we believe, that his DNA is on those cuffs. That killer is absolutely not Patrick Baker, according to scientific evidence in this case. But it's not just science that excludes Patrick from committing the shooting that we're talking about. It's also the original descriptions given by eyewitnesses. These are impartial and objective people. The victim's own mother and child described the shooter with brown eyes and tattoos. As you can see, Patrick is a blue-eyed person, and I will represent to you that he has no tattoos. And you won't find a single person in the Commonwealth of Kentucky that will dispute that. Go look at the Department of Correction records. Patrick has no tattoos, and he never has. There is an alternate suspect out there who we believe killed Donald Mills. And we would urge for a law enforcement agency to actually investigate that person and bring closure to the victim's family in this case. They deserve justice. But they are not the only ones that deserve justice, because Patrick spent 5 years incarcerated for a murder he didn't commit, and then in what should have been one of the most happy moments of his life, where his family finally had him home for the holidays, something horrific happened in the Commonwealth of Kentucky because of the person who exonerated Patrick, Governor Bevin. There were assumptions made here based upon Patrick's family supporting Governor Bevin. They voted for him in his first election. They supported him through his re-election efforts. And once you all are able to speak to people who were actually involved in investigating Mr. Baker's pardon application, you'll determine on your own, through objective evidence, that there was a legitimate investigation conducted into Patrick Baker's pardon application, that he was actually questioned extensively for several hours by a member of this government. And I think you'll find that other people were questioned as well. And Jackie Steele, the Commonwealth Attorney from Knox County, he knew about this, but he knew about some other things too. In March of 2018, my law firm was representing 3 plaintiffs in 2 separate lawsuits, Amanda Hoskins and Jonathan Taylor. That was a lawsuit against Knox County, the Barville Police Department, and Kentucky State police officers, including Jason York and Brian Johnson. At that same time, our law firm, Lovey & Lovey, represented William Anderson in a separate lawsuit against those same KSP officers and against the Knox County Sheriff's Department. There were depositions taken in those cases, particularly of Detective Jason York and Detective Brian Johnson. And those are two of the detectives who investigated Patrick Baker's case beginning in 2014. In March of 2018, it was requested that we produce deposition transcripts and whatever evidence we had by a member of the government, somebody in the Justice Cabinet here, named Denny Butler, so that people in this state could investigate these Kentucky State police officers for framing innocent people for murder. And we gave deposition transcripts and evidence showing that falsified affidavits were given, that perjurious testimony was given, and that there was a witness in one of those cases that was literally charged with murder. And Detective Jason York admitted at a deposition under oath that he never informed the prosecutor, Jackie Steele, that he charged this woman with murder, and that he struck a deal with her attorney that if she implicated my client, Jonathan Taylor, that she would get to leave. And she did. In her arrest warrant, the criminal complaint never was made part of the Commonwealth Attorney's file. Now, Jackie Steele ultimately dismissed that case, but significant evidence was produced from our law firm to Mr. Butler for the purposes of an investigation taking place in the Justice Cabinet and hopefully the Kentucky State Police, into whether these officers should be charged with not only violating the constitutional rights of citizens in the state, but whether they should be criminally charged for committing perjury and obstruction of justice. That was in March of 2018. What you'll find when you actually look at Mr. Baker's pardon application is that he didn't apply for a pardon until after that date. We had nothing to do with Mr. Baker's pardon efforts. And Denny Butler, as a member of the Justice Cabinet, was looking into these officers' misconduct from the Kentucky State Police before Patrick ever filed for a pardon application, before his family ever held a fundraiser. It had absolutely nothing to do with it. And I think when you talk to Denny Butler, who used to be a state representative, who actually worked at the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department for more than a decade of his life. He worked at the Louisville Police Department in the mid-2000s and was the sergeant of the cold case unit there, where he personally led homicide investigations that led to the exonerations of Kerry Porter, who not only has been exonerated, but obtained a $7.5 million settlement. Denny Butler led to the exoneration of Edwin Chandler, who not only was exonerated in Jefferson County, but obtained an $8.5 million settlement. That Denny Butler was behind those efforts as a law enforcement officer because he knows how to investigate homicides. And Denny Butler was the person who questioned Patrick Baker with regard to this case. And I think that when you all talk to Mr. Butler, you'll find that there were conversations in the Justice Cabinet and with the former commissioner of the Kentucky State Police, Rick Sanders, about whether these officers who framed Patrick, whether they should be criminally prosecuted. I think you'll find some interesting stuff from Mr. Tilley and Mr. Sanders and what efforts they took to stop a criminal prosecution. And those officers today, they're still members of the Kentucky State Police. Mr. York, he's actually been promoted to sergeant. In our Anderson case, we actually recovered, Mr. Anderson, by the way, was tried for murder during the same period of time. It was actually the year before Patrick. He was acquitted in a death penalty case. Mr. Anderson's case was Brian Johnson's first ever homicide investigation as a lead detective. Mr. Johnson from KSP was the lead detective on Patrick's case. There's overlap between in the two lawsuits that have been filed, and certainly if there's one in this case, that those officers would be named there, I presume, as well. But there is overlap not only between the officers, but the type of police misconduct that was occurring. So while people want to look at a fundraiser, what we'll really be looking at is whether the people with badges in this state should really have those badges. And the question that should be asked is what Governor Bevin was doing within his administration to try to bring these officers where serious allegations of misconduct have been alleged, what Governor Bevin was doing to get rid of them from the Kentucky State Police. And again, this is prior to a pardon application being filed. And one of the interrogations that took place of a witness in the Anderson case, egregious misconduct is heard. And Jimmer, I'd like for you to play that, and I'm going to talk about how that relates directly to what happened with Patrick Baker's case.
Thank you. Know, look at me.
Yes, sir.
You know that car and Bobby was at Bivens' house before he got killed. You know that. And I know you know
I
that.
do not know that. I do not know if Bob was over there or not. All I did.
You know the car was there.
I do know the car was over there when.
No. There's no
During the
evidence.
day, how long was the black car sitting there?
During the day, I never seen the car there during the day. Seriously, I did not.
Did you have your head stuck in a sand pile or what?
Now, I got Brenda fix Thanksgiving supper the day before Thanksgiving. But I never looked over and paid no attention if that car was over there.
I'm gonna put you in fucking prison because you goddamn lied. I'm not so fucking sick of that goddamn bullshit. You fucking lied out everything goddamn else. Fuck you, fuck you, fuck you. Let's put his ass in the fucking jail.
What for?
You a goddamn
Brother, we got you.
Sergeant York was questioned a couple of weeks ago under oath in a federal case and said if he had the opportunity, he would do that same thing again tomorrow. Mr. York was one of the detectives who was investigating Patrick Baker's case. So when these questions are asked about why is Patrick here, Patrick is free today because DNA evidence clears him from committing murder, because eyewitness descriptions have never matched him, and because egregious police misconduct was being looked into by Governor Bevin and people under his command, like Denny Butler. Now, why these police officers are continued to be employed is a question that only the former commissioner, Rick Sanders, can answer, or the former, or Mr. Tilley from the Justice Cabinet. And I think that Denny Butler can answer some serious questions for each of you as the communication he had with Mr. Tilley and where the request came from for him to look into Mr. Baker's pardon application in the first place. Mr. Tilley's representations that he didn't know about this investigation going on into Mr. Baker's case are simply false. They're absolutely false. And when we talk about this fundraiser, one thing I want to refer you all to is that you'll see a letter that was directed from the office of the governor in June of 2018 to Mr. and Mrs. John Baker. And in this letter, it wasn't from the governor himself, it was from an office of constituent services, probably for people who aren't able to find the online application adequately, so they attach the application to this letter. And in here it says, please be aware the completion and submission of this application means only that your request for pardon will be considered, not that one will be granted. Patrick Baker's case was treated like any other pardon in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And that's why it was granted. It wasn't a fundraiser. Frankly, if you were going to pay off somebody who's a politician, you probably wouldn't do it in a formal way where you disclose that to anybody in the state who wants to go on the government website and find out who's at a fundraiser. Probably not the best way to pay off a politician. There is absolutely nothing inappropriate about the Baker family supporting Mr. Bevin's reelection efforts. And even though citizens in Kentucky decided not to reelect Mr. Bevin, it doesn't matter that what he did with his pardons, and especially in this case, was unjust. And in fact, what we think Mr. Bevin did here is justice at its best. And it is what an executive power is supposed to do, is that when the Knox County court system failed Mr. Baker, and when the appellate courts failed Mr. Baker, the only option he had left was turning to a governor with courage, with an executive power. And that's absolutely what happened here. There's something that I also want to talk about, which nobody has talked about yet. When the Knox County Commonwealth Attorney says, or when the Knox County judge who oversaw this case, David Williams, says it's one of the strongest cases he's ever seen, I believe was a quote that I saw out there. I hope that you all would look at what Mr. Baker was originally charged with, murder, and consider the fact that he was never convicted of murder. He was convicted of reckless homicide. And the jury, with the separate counts, recommended that those counts be consolidated and run concurrently, and that he only served 12 years in prison. This was a compromised jury verdict from Knox County. This wasn't a strong case. And if things were done differently on both sides of the aisle, Mr. Baker would have never been wrongfully convicted in the first place. We shouldn't be here today because those KSP officers should have never been in a position to have Mr. Baker wrongfully convicted. And we shouldn't be here today under the allegations that have surfaced in this case. Mr. Baker's family did absolutely nothing wrong. They had incredible names in their community, and they built some serious lives where their reputations have been tarnished, all because they supported a politician and they had a loved one who was wrongfully convicted. And only through Governor Bevin's courageous actions, through his recognition of the DNA and the eyewitness descriptions, and the recognition that these police officers that have been sued repeatedly should not have a badge, by him taking a deep look, which people around here should do, to see how many other people may be framed for crimes they didn't commit, only through that type of consideration is why there was a pardon here based on Mr. Baker's actual innocence. Now, Patrick has a few words that he wants to share with you all about his experience and what it's like to be wrongfully convicted and to come home.
All right, thank you all for coming today. Sorry I'm a little under the weather. I think he's covered pretty much everything as far as the criminal part of it goes, but I'd like to thank Mr. Bevin for looking into this, and all the people behind the scenes that actually dug into this, done their own investigation. Hopefully you all maybe can look into that a little bit too. I am innocent. I want to thank Mr. Bevin for his courageous actions and allowing me to come home to my family. It's been a long journey, been rough, but yeah, glad. And maybe, like I said, the pardon is never paid for by my family. That's something, you know, I mean, common sense can kind of tell you that, but you're more than welcome to look into that. So, but, thank you. Hopefully y'all can give me my privacy. I'm kind of duck out now, so thank you all.
One thing that we're calling on is for Governor Beshear to authorize his Attorney General, when he got sworn in today, to conduct an investigation into members of the Kentucky State Police officers, specifically the ones that have been sued in the cases that we've cited to, and in relation to Mr. Baker's case, to see whether these officers should be criminally charged with violating the laws of Kentucky and the constitutional rights of its citizens. That is something that the Baker family hopes can happen, so that the victims in those cases can get closure, and so that nobody else in Knox County and Laurel County and Harlan County and all those counties under Post 10 and Post 11, so that none of those victims' families get re-victimized by having a false belief that somebody was rightfully convicted when the real murderer was left to roam the streets. And that's exactly what has repeatedly happened, including here and including our homicide investigations. With that, we're happy to answer questions.
So, State Police Commissioner Rick Sanders, what was his reaction when confronted with what Danny Butler found?
I think you should speak to Mr. Butler. I was not a part of that conversation. What I could tell you is that Mr. York and Mr. Johnson are still members of the Kentucky State Police. They haven't been fired. And I think that when you do FOIA requests for members of the Kentucky State Police personnel files, you'll find an interesting series of events that occurred 2 days after Jackie Steele's deposition in the Hoskins case as it relates to Detective York. And Mr. Sanders will have some knowledge about that. I can't disclose the underlying of what those documents are, but we should take.
Did Sanders disagree with what Butler said, or did he say he couldn't do anything about it?
You should ask him. I think that Mr. Butler will be willing to shed light on what happened behind the scenes with regard to this pardon and a few others that he was involved in investigating.
Elliot, what's new now? You mentioned DNA and you mentioned the alleged wrongdoing of York and Johnson. Did Mr. Baker's defense team not have that information when he was originally tried?
I think that it could have been used better. I do think there was some destruction of evidence that happened prior to the original trial that the judge actually found to be in bad faith by Kentucky State Police officers. There were some issues on that around appeal. In terms of what's new, there is some new evidence that occurred that I'm aware of that occurred during Mr. Butler's looking into this case. And it relates to one of the other co-defendants who pled guilty. I can't really say more than that, but perhaps Mr. Butler can.
Are you claiming wrongdoing by those two police officers in this case?
Absolutely.
What about
So what specifically are you saying that those two officers did wrong in this case in the Baker case?
I'm saying that if those officers in this case had investigated it properly, it's not just them, but other members of their team, if this case had been investigated properly, Patrick Baker would have never been charged with murder. I think that there was evidence that was destroyed from.
Are you talking about the cell phone
I am.
evidence?
Yes.
But that came up in the appeals decision, and the Court of Appeals ruled that that didn't make a difference, and they
The court, sure, and the Court of Appeals did not reverse the lower court's the verdict, but that's different than saying that it's acceptable. What I'll also say is that we are uncovering in these other federal lawsuits evidence of additional misconduct every day. And constitutionally, Mr. Baker would have had a due process right to that evidence prior to his trial. And it certainly wasn't disclosed, and that was, there was some argument about that. For further allegations of what these police officers did wrong here, the family is considering legal options. One of those options would be a lawsuit. And in that lawsuit, I imagine that we would lay out exactly how Patrick Baker was framed for murder.
And the co-defendant was the one who said that Patrick did it. Are you saying that the co-defendant was lying when he said that Patrick did it?
Absolutely.
Do you think that prosecutor Jackie Steele should also be investigated for any criminal wrongdoing?
What I will tell you, if you look deep in Jackie Steele's deposition, is that when we sued in Amanda Hoskins' case, when we filed that lawsuit, one of the first people that Jason York sent a text message to was Jackie Steele, asking for who he should hire as a civil defense attorney. Jackie Steele gave that recommendation. So I'm not calling for any criminal investigation of Jackie Steele. What I'm saying is that Jackie Steele, given this text message and the fact that he hasn't done anything to change the way that things are being done in his county, is not an impartial prosecutor that should be responsible for investigating these police officers. And for that reason, we think that the Attorney General needs to step in.
Do you think he's a crooked prosecutor?
I think that I'm not gonna call Jackie Steele a crooked prosecutor. What I would say is that he got it wrong in this case, and that I think that prosecutors under Rule 3.8 in Kentucky have an ethical obligation to prosecute police officers for perjury and official misconduct, and that it has not been done with regard to any officers in these cases. Jackie Steele admitted under oath in a deposition that information that Detective York put in a search warrant was false. That search warrant was under oath. He also admitted that he was never informed that Detective York charged a witness of murder. That criminal complaint was never given to him, and that the $1 million bond that was assigned to it was not known to him. And that he had no idea throughout the 5 years he prosecuted these 3 people for murder, Amanda Hoskins, Jonathan Taylor, and William Lester, he had no idea that this cop had charged a witness with murder. That is shocking misconduct, and that's something that an attorney general here should look into, so that members of the Kentucky State Police that are doing these types of things do not put people like Patrick and Amanda and Jonathan and William in a position where they could be wrongfully convicted.
Do you think that there's any criminal wrongdoing within the Kentucky State Police beyond just those 2 officers who are involved in this case?
So we've sued a number of officers outside of Johnson and York, and the briefs that we filed publicly explain why. What I'll tell you is that one of the supervisors in the Hoskins case admitted that she doesn't give any supervision. It was a supervisor. She actually was involved in this case as well, but she doesn't supervise people under her on homicide cases. She doesn't give direction to detectives under her command because she doesn't have any experience investigating homicides. And that recording that you all heard earlier, where a chair is being thrown at a wall, where a witness is being threatened, where Detective York admits to hitting a hat off the witness's head, the supervisor admitted under oath that she was watching that, and she didn't disagree with anything that happened in there. So yeah, it's a much more broad problem than just these 2 officers. I think that Kentucky State Police, what we've shown in these lawsuits and what's happened with Patrick, is an organization that needs to have a complete restructuring. And that hopefully, now that there's a new commissioner, hopefully that commissioner will look deep into things and get rid of police officers that shouldn't be there.
Mr. Baker, when you got word that you were going to be a free man, describe your reaction to this.
Disbelief, I think. Still kind of in disbelief. It's kind of like a dream almost, I guess, kind of playing out right now. I mean, hopefully this will kind of die down and I can kind of go on with my life, I guess, but yeah, it's definitely disbelief about how I can say.
Did you think it was going to happen?
I try to stay positive, I ain't gonna lie, but after locked up for a couple years or whatever, it's it's a little rough, but yeah, I tried to stay positive. I was hoping for something, like I said, to the appeals court or something like that. So I out the pardon. It was a wonderful surprise, and I guess a great early Christmas present.
Prior to the donation that your parents gave, that we've all been talking about now, had they donated to Bevin's campaign in the past?
The family, I don't know the answer to that question. What I will say is that the family did vote for Bevin originally. They've supported him throughout his election efforts, and that the donation that happened was completely unrelated to the eventual pardon. And I think when you all talked to Mr. Butler, as I talked about a little bit today with the timeline, March of 2018 is when people in the Justice Cabinet were presented with evidence relating to these KSP officers. I think what you'll find is that about a year later is when Mr. Butler was asked to look at this particular pardon application, and that's when he realized that York and Johnson, these people who he was advocating for an investigation, that they were involved in this case.
I don't know if you have an exact answer, but the reason we're here today is because Bevin did pardon him, and now you're calling on Bashir to start an investigation into these KSP officers. If he had not gotten pardoned, would the evidence, in your opinion, still be as strong? Where would we be at in the case? Would you be asking for the same thing?
I think we have asked, if I had the power to call a governor in this state, and he would actually pick up the phone, or she would pick up the phone, every day I would call and ask for a criminal prosecution of police officers in Kentucky for framing people for crimes that they committed. Absolutely. Would you all care to listen to us today if Patrick didn't get a pardon and these allegations weren't made? I think that's a different question. But what we're doing in through these lawsuits is trying to expose misconduct that nobody's ever really learned about before with regard to KSP. So yes, I would. I don't know if anybody would listen.
Mr. Slosser, how did you get involved with this case? And also, did you have an array of people you were seeking criminal support based on your own knowledge of misconduct that was accepted or not accepted?
Sure. So with this case, it's privilege how I came into it, so I can't get into that, and I apologize. But what I'll say is I didn't have anything to do with the pardon efforts.
Okay.
You know, we did. One of Amy and I, Ms. Staples and I, one of our clients was exonerated through a pardon, Keith West, and we had an evidentiary this summer where many of your organizations covered, and Denny Butler testified at that hearing. And in that case, there's a Louisville police officer who's currently facing criminal charges for the destruction of evidence in that very case. So Governor Bevin did an incredible thing for Keith West, and we went to court first, just like Patrick did. We tried to do it that way, and a judge in Jefferson County didn't have the courage to do the right thing, even though we had a prosecutor who was very high up under Attorney General Bashir. We had an assistant attorney general testify for us that he would never put this detective, Mark Handy, on the stand again because of the allegations of misconduct that happened. We had eyewitnesses come up there and say what Mr. Handy did to them. We had Mr. Butler, testify. We had the trial prosecutor testify that if he had known this, he would have had second thoughts about even charging Keith West with murder, the double homicide back in the 90s. We did the right thing there. We tried to get it fixed. We were doing we filed a notice of appeal. We were ready to plow forward. We also submitted a pardon application, and Governor Bevin did the Egregious Act, and Keith West has his name back.
You've stated that Mr. Baker was framed, and there are 2 other individuals in this particular case that are still locked up. Would you say that their being locked up also has to do with the alleged KSP wrongdoings, or?
So here's what I would say. There's been a lot of talk about whether Patrick's pardon was motivated by monetary means, and whether these other co-defendants, their current incarceration, whether it's because they didn't have the money to hold a fundraiser. What I would ask all of you to do is go send a FOIA request to the government, and I think what you'll find is that these co-defendants didn't submit a pardon application. That this has nothing to do with a fundraiser, and it has everything to do with the people who looked into this under Governor Bevin. And obviously the governor makes his own decision. I think, you all know much better than I do that Governor Bevin doesn't seem like somebody who lets people make decisions for him. He seems to be his own man. And when he looked into this case, he clearly must have felt compelled as to Patrick Baker's innocence. The co-defendant who testified against him pled guilty. The other, I know Elijah Messer was convicted at a trial, and Elijah's actually a witness in William Anderson's case. It's not just the police officers that are connected in these communities and in these cases, it's the witnesses as well. I don't speak for them. I know that they don't have, that the eyewitness descriptions of the shooter and that the DNA don't match Patrick Baker. And that's all I need to know. And that clearly made a big impact in these jury deliberations. I don't know how many of these jurors are spoken to, but the fact that he wasn't convicted of murder and that they recommended a concurrent sentence to me as a defense attorney on criminal cases indicates that this was a compromised verdict. And obviously there's some new evidence that shows that they got it.
Did
Mr.
anyone in
Baker, what's
Patrick's
gonna-
family ever have a direct conversation with Governor Bevin?
I don't have, obviously there was a fundraiser and you have photographs of it in your newspaper. has shown-
About the part, about his
About
case.
I don't have the answer to that question. What I would say is that if I had a loved one, if I've had clients who are wrongfully convicted, we exonerate them. We call the prosecutors, we call the police officers, we talk to anybody that we can talk to on behalf of our clients to get them free. And Damon Preston obviously met with the governor. So I don't have an answer to that question. Would it be improper for them to do that? Absolutely not. It would be surprising to me, if you have a loved one who is wrongfully convicted, if you wouldn't reach out to whoever you can reach out to try to get somebody to look at the case. And again, Governor Bevin is somebody who makes his own decisions. Frankly, that's probably led, a little bit to why he wasn't successful in the end in the re-election. But nobody's bribing a multi-millionaire governor with a $4,000 donation to free somebody from prison for murder. And the fact that those allegations have been put out there is just irresponsible.
Do you think that there are people in jail in Kentucky right now who are innocent of the crimes they're convicted of, who aren't free because they didn't have access to have a direct conversation with the governor and present their case directly to them?
Statistics show that between 4 and 10% of people in prison are wrongfully convicted. So, we personally have freed so many people from Kentucky prisons who have been in there for decades. I don't think that you can necessarily link the fact that these people are wrongfully convicted to the fact that their families don't have money to hold a fundraiser, which is, I think, the general allegation. What I would say is that Governor Bevin did a courageous thing when he looked at cases where people were alleging innocence. And there are always victims in these murder cases, and no murder is ever good, right? There's been a lot of focus on the Delmar Parton case, about how the victim was beheaded. There hasn't been any discussion as to the merits of that case and what happened to Mr. Parton. I don't represent it. In the Keith West case, a client that Ms. Staples and I represent, it was a double homicide, where he admitted to doing it in self-defense because these people were going to murder him and had all the tools in the car to do so. Like, murder is terrible. But you've got to focus on the merits of the case instead of just looking as to what the conviction is. And Governor Bevin here, from what I've seen, the last report I saw was upwards of 670 maybe pardons or commutations. But he clearly had a lot on his mind about trying to reform a very broken criminal justice system in the state. And whether you agree with his politics or not, reform is necessary, and people need to look into these cases to see whether these people had credible allegations of being innocent and wrongfully convicted.
I just have one question for you, Mr. Baker. What's next? I know you said you've asked for some privacy, but do you have plans to get back in the workforce and do something, or, volunteer with your organization to help others that, like you say, have been wrongfully convicted?
Yeah, that's something I'm definitely gonna look into a little bit. I know I've been around people that have been, in prisons and jails that were innocent. So that's something I definitely want to look into. Maybe, even a jury class, maybe, where jurors maybe kind of get an idea of what they're going into before, expect 12 of our peers to just step in and make a life-altering decision about somebody, without really, being completely educated maybe on the criminal, side of things. So, I'm gonna leave my options open right now. I don't know, see where things go.
Do you have a job lined up yet?
Not this second. No, like I said, this is all still a surprise to me.
You were released when?
Last Wednesday. So, yes, I'm still, like I said, it's disbelief to me. So, I'll sit around and do some job searching maybe after the first of the year, maybe.
Now that you've hinted at it, but I'll ask you directly, are you gonna file a lawsuit here?
I imagine that you would not be surprised if we were to. Put away, I think a lot of my clients around the state, wrongful conviction lawsuits from Newport to Knox County, everywhere in between. And I think if you, and many of you talked to our clients when they got released or when we filed a lawsuit. And I think if you all gave them the choice of whether they could hold the police officers who caused them to be wrongfully convicted, whether they can hold them responsible criminally, put them in jail for a certain period of time, or whether they could get monetary compensation, I think the overwhelming majority would want those cops to face criminal prosecution. So I can't do that. The law doesn't allow me to do that. The law only allows for us to file 1983 lawsuits to seek financial compensation, but it'll never fix those years that you lost. Any amount of money isn't gonna fix, people calling the Baker's home more than 100 times the day after this pardon was released, or photographers being on their doorstep, or the salacious allegations being made against them that they somehow committed an illegal act by paying for their loved one's exoneration. That is harmful. And it absolutely ruined what should have been one of the best moments of their life, which is Patrick coming home when he should have never been taken.
I thought the family was supposed to be here today.
They are. So Patrick's parents, one of the employees of their company, had some sort of trucking accident or some sort of car accident. So yes, you're right. But one thing I do want you to know is whatever happens from this, criminal investigation of the police, some sort of inquiry into the legitimacy of this pardon, the Baker family is going to cooperate with whoever wants to talk to them. We're not hiding from anything. And you'll see, I think, when you talk to Denny Butler, when you talk to Governor Bevin, when you talk to everybody in between, that this pardon was based on innocence, and that people in the Justice Cabinet, the KSB Commissioner, the Governor, on down, that they knew that this investigation, this inquiry, whatever they want to call it, they knew that this was taking place.
Well, we've been trying to run something. So what lawsuits are you considering filing? A wrongful conviction suit or something against the police officers in this case? What do you
Well,
consider?
it's one and the same. So we're considering our legal options. The only option would be to file a lawsuit for the malicious prosecution of Patrick Baker for racketeering.
Okay, and then you mentioned Damon Preston, but Mr. Baker was not on the list of names that Damon Preston gave to the governor. Why do you think that is?
Well, because Damon Preston didn't represent him. I mean, Patrick Baker had a defense attorney who represented him on appeals, not so I haven't talked to Damon about this, but I think that would be one.
So we've been trying to reach Danny Butler for days, and he won't comment. Do you know if he's going to speak to the media ever about this case?
I think so. We should call him. With that, we're gonna go. You should call him. I think you should all reach out to Mr. Butler. He is a person who's been responsible for countless exonerations in this case, and his experience as a homicide investigator is not comparable to anybody from KSP who worked on the underlying investigation. I think Denny is the only person that could really give the answers, aside from the governor, as to what went on between 2018, when I gave him the evidence in our civil suits, and last week when this pardon happened. So thank you all for coming.